What tips do you have for someone being a guest on podcasts? Because I know my first podcast I was on, I was scared. I didn't know what I was trying to accomplish or what to share or anything like that. What tips do you have for someone like that?
Oh, great question. And, I always say podcasts are an awful place to sell, but they're a great place to get people to know you exist. Right. Rand Fishkin from SEO Moz, best tweet I've ever seen. He said, the best way to sell something today is not to sell anything, but earn the awareness, respect, and trust of those who might buy. That's what you're trying to do. And if you look back and say, these tools amplify what we already know and what we do, right? So you can either do it really poorly or real well. We get together at a meeting and, somebody introduces you to me. We talk a little bit, get the backstory. That works really well. At the end of that, I'm like, Nathan, that sounds great. I need that. How can I work with you? The flip side is if you came in and started to sell me really hard, like you were selling life insurance, not only would I not buy from you, I would avoid you from then on. Gary Vaynerchuk talks about, jab, 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 right hook. And I probably missed a couple jabs in there. I look at it as serve, 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 ask, right? And so if you serve the podcast host and make them look like a genius for having you on by adding so much value, if you serve the audience with free offers and extra value there, if you serve the community by promoting the episode, by sharing it, all the rest of that, you're serving, all of a sudden people are going to ask, how can I work with you? And to me, that's the best way to do it. I think it was DJ Doug Sandler from Nice Guys on Business gave the advice one time. He said, don't promote yourself on the podcast. He said, if you do a good job, I will promote you better than you ever could. And I think that's so true because, if I say I'm great, what comes across is, boy, that guy is really, really vain.
Right.
But if the podcast says it, the person they already know, they trust, they respect, wow, that's something that you could never get on your own. So to me, it's like always serve. Make the host look like a genius for having you there.
Yeah, completely agree. What about on the hosting side? I mean, we're about 60 days into this podcast now. It's a whole new world, completely different from being a guest. For someone there who's starting a podcast or they're trying to get their podcast off the ground or they've never done it before, they're on episode 1, what advice do you have for that?
Yeah, and I'll give a little disclaimer here that I have done over 1,200 podcast interviews and I still haven't launched my own podcast. Anybody that says doing a podcast is easy has either never done it or never done it well. So Nathan, my hat goes off to you on the excellent podcast you have. And I say that because, leave a rating and review. If you enjoy this, not just because it helps Nathan, but because it helps other people find it. So my advice to podcasters is not based off of my experience. It's based more off the data that I've seen. The podcasts that are doing the best right now are the ones that are the authentic conversations, right? This is the same conversation you and I would be having if we were at Traffic and Conversion Summit sitting down, right? We'd just be having the conversation. You wouldn't have a list of 6 questions that said, I asked the same 6 questions to every guest. That when it started out, that was podcasting. And it worked really well. I think we've evolved off of that. Be interested in being interesting. Bigger is not always better. Some of the best guests out there are the ones that you've never heard of before. The example I use, I love Dave Ramsey, right? Great man, great message. He's helped a lot of people. But if Dave Ramsey was on your podcast, I know every talking point he's going to say there, right? Because he's going to stick to that. If you introduce me to one of your friends that I have never heard of before, I guarantee I'm going to learn something different from them. And so with that, anybody that's coming up with a new podcast, I say make it conversational, make it interesting, and introduce new voices to the community. The other thing on there too, from a selfish standpoint, if you got Dave Ramsey on your podcast, do you think he'd be really interested in promoting it to his entire audience? Probably not. Yeah. Right. It's probably one of, 10 podcasts or media appearances he's doing that day. But if you get somebody on that is a peer that loves what you're doing, man, you just You just came on and talked with somebody that could be a huge fanboy for FreeUp, not only now, but for years to come. And, I always say the richness of our lives is the richness of our relationships. And so use your podcast to build those relationships.
I think that's great advice. It's funny, when we were planning out this podcast, Connor and I came up with these lists of questions, and we're like, oh, we'll ask this one and then this one. And then by the end of like episode 3, I just threw it all away. I'm like, this is garbage. That's not how I'm going to run an interview. Like I'd much rather, like you said, have the conversations. And sometimes you go in with a plan. Like you're coming on this podcast now. I was pretty confident we were going to talk about podcasting, but you had no idea what direction it exactly is going to go, and you got to go with it.
And I think from both sides there, a lot of times we'll tell the guest to just ask beforehand to the host, what do you hope to get out of this? How can I add the best value? And then the host typically asks the guest the same thing. So we're figuring out where we want to go with this interview, what dance we're going to do before the music starts, but it's not scripted. My corporate legal department did not sign off on this interview and all the questions, and yours didn't either. This is just, two guys that are talking about things that interest them and hopefully will interest the people that are listening.
What else did I miss about the podcast industry? What else should people know that the average listener wouldn't be aware of?
Yeah. There's 700,000 podcasts out there right now. And people are like, wow, that's amazing. Well, yeah, but most podcasts die within the first 10 episodes. There's 250,000 that actually